Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is, in my opinion, a very, very scary, great twist and a classic edition of a campfire story. It's actually entitled Campfire Story, and I think you guys are going to really, really enjoy this. I hope you do. Of course, please do let me know down below in the comments. As ever, please do like and share. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story. Campfire Story. It was a night just like this. 6 campers were out with their scoutmaster on an overnight camping trip, and they were just settling in after a long day of hiking. Suddenly, they heard a wailing coming from a forest, and it chilled them to the bone. They had all heard of the Woods Witch, of course. Everyone around here had. About how she lured all those children into the forest back in the 1800s. About how they found them eaten and nothing but piles of bones. And of course, about how they found Chimney Cave to be nothing but a charnel pit, a ghoulish abattoir fit only for a creature of darkness. They also knew how the townspeople buried her alive in there after they set fire to the inside. They didn't believe the legends about the witch's ghost that still haunts the woods, so they unwisely went to sleep. Then they heard it, deep in the night, as the wailing got closer and closer to their campsite. The scouts couldn't sleep and laid huddled in their sleeping bags as the wailing grew closer and closer. They heard the trees shake and the leaves crackle as the wailing came closer and closer. And then finally, boo! We all jumped, but none of us jumped higher than Reggie Bobby, grinning like an idiot as he stood at the edge of the firelight, and he started to laugh as he pointed at the front of Reggie's shorts. "Look, guys, Wedgie has a widow accident," he said, and cawed laughter as his other 2 meathead friends laughed too. Mark and Kyle weren't much higher in the brains department than Bobby, but they knew enough to laugh when he laughed, or they might find themselves on the end of a beating. I looked over at Reggie and shook my head. How did a kid like Reggie get roped into Boy Scouts? I had been with the Scouts for about 3 years now, and I think if my dad hadn't been so serious about me staying in, I would have left after 1. I know it doesn't mean much to you now, kiddo, but if you can climb the ranks, maybe even stay until middle school, it'll look good on your college transcript one day. You've got to think about those extracurriculars while you're young. Yeah, thanks, Dad. 3 years of being in a 4-man scout troop with Bobby, Terry, and his idiot friends, and all I had to show for it was some knot tying knowledge and the ability to identify poison oak. The last 3 years had also been filled with Bobby and his friends trying to tease and bully me, and me just ignoring them until they stopped, only to start up again a little while later. In a way, it had been a blessing when Reggie joined. Reggie, this overweight kid with glasses and a fear of everything, had transferred into my troop about a month ago. Reggie and his mum had apparently just moved into town, and even though he'd been in Scouts before, he seemed pretty pathetic at mostly everything. The only thing he seemed to excel at, and even if I felt a little bad about thinking about it, was being a big target for Bobby and his friends. I felt bad for him, of course, sitting out here in his chocolate-stained uniform and his disc-coloured shorts that had been peed in 1 too many times. But it was also kind of a nice time to get a break from Bobby and his incessant need to torment someone. Now, Scoutmaster Mike, our designated Scoutmaster for the trip, sighed and glared at Bobby. "Bobby, Terry, if you don't calm down, I'm going to call your father and tell him to come pick you up. Is that what you want?" Bobby's father was the only thing that seemed to take the wind out of his sails. Mr. Terry was a beefy car mechanic with no neck and big scarred hands that made me think he beat the cars into submission before he fixed them. He always showed up to pick Bobby up in his ratty old blue Ford, wearing his faded blue jumpsuit with Terry stitched on it, and a slim little cigar poking out of his mouth, which he growled around to tell Bobby to get the hell in the truck. I'm missing my dinner. It had been unanimously decided. My dad told me once that Bobby's dad didn't have to chaperone scout outings, as this seemed to be just fine with Mr. Terry. Reggie sniffed and sat up off the ground quickly. Mr. Mike, I think I need to go change my pants. Scoutmaster Mike just sighed. Oh, go ahead, Reggie. The rest of you go get ready for bed. We have a long hike to Howling Caves tomorrow, and I don't want to hear about anybody being tired tomorrow morning. Lights out in 20. And with that, he set about getting the campsite ready for bedtime as we four shuffled into the big 6-man tent we were all sharing. I went off to the tent. It wouldn't do any good to argue. Scoutmaster Mike wasn't an ideal scoutmaster at arguing, and usually it just got you into a locked tent flap as he sat behind it and ignored you. He wasn't supposed to lock his tent, but my dad told me Mr. Mike had this weird fear of bugs crawling into his tent at night, so he always made sure his tent was secured. Reggie came into the tent, then a pair of pyjama bottoms with cartoon characters all over them, having replaced his soiled pants, and the 3 boys that were gathered there around Bobby's sleeping bag hooted and mocked him. Bobby had taken some of his father's dirty magazines, it seemed, and after their tired game of pick on Fat Boy had ended, they went back to ogling and looking at the glossy pictures. Reggie crawled into his sleeping bag, looking for all the world like a big green caterpillar with the shakes. And I went back to my book. When it became apparent that Scoutmaster Mike wasn't going to yell at us to turn the lights off, and no one was going to opt for an early bedtime, I rolled over and went to sleep. The next morning, Scoutmaster Mike didn't come out for breakfast. We banged on his tent and tried to get his attention, but he wouldn't come out, and the cooler with the food was in his tent. So after breakfast of granola bars, water and trail mix, we started getting restless. We were supposed to go on our hike to Howling Caves today, and as the morning crept closer to midday, we all began to get pissy, as small children would do. Bobby said, loudly, a number of times that he'd just cut the tent open and see what was taking Scoutmaster Mike so long, but after he failed to find his pocket knife 3 or 4 times, the threat stopped being so threatening. I, for one, was pretty glad he had lost it. Nothing in these woods frightened me more than Bobby Terry with a knife. Finally, around 10:30, Bobby announced that we should all just pack up and go to the Howling Cave ourselves. Without Mike? Without Mr. Mike? Reggie asked, a stutter creeping into his voice. Oh no, Wedgie, I guess we can't go without him. Maybe we'll just roll his tent along behind us so he can sleep and chaperone us. Yes, without him, stupid. It's not like all of us haven't been before. Which was true, actually. When we were first-year scouts, we had all camped here, and Scoutmaster Eddie had taken us up to Howling Cave and let us explore it a little. I remember being disappointed, though, because not only had none of us found out why it was called Howling Cave, at the age of 6, I thought it was because wolves lived there, and I wanted to find one so I could keep it as a pet. But Bobby had also pushed Kyle off a rock shelf while they were horsing around, so we had to leave before we had explored all the tunnels. If we went by ourselves, though. I put a few things in my pack, and as Bobby and his friends headed out, I tagged along behind them. Bobby noticed me, of course. You coming too, Squints? He asked, bringing his old nickname out of mothballs for the occasion. As long as you don't get us all lost, I guess I am, I said. We hadn't gone far when we heard a loud running, huffing figure came running up the trail to join us. Reggie had thrown on his bulging knapsack. His mother had packed half a pharmacy and 2/3 of a Sears camping department into it, and was now running after us like the devil himself was after us. Bobby sneered at him, but replaced the sneer with a big cheesy grin when he came blustering up to join us. Oh good, you made it, Wedgie. This hike just wouldn't be the same without you. he said in a saccharine sweet voice, and the rest of the hike was spent with Bobby and his friends having a whispered conversation. Despite what I'd said earlier, there was no chance of us getting lost. We may not have been in a state park or anything, but Howling Cave doubled as the trailhead for a branch of the Appalachian Trail, and there were markers all along the way. The hike was an easy one, half a mile up to the cave and half a mile back on fairly level terrain through the cool shadows of the woods. Bobby and his friends led the way, and Reggie and I were relegated to picking up the rear as we went along. I had expected Reggie to slow us down or start whining like he usually did, but he kept pace somehow and seemed pretty comfortable as we rolled along. Even so, there was sweat standing out on all four of us by the time we got to Howling Cave. The entrance yawned open like a hungry mouth, and as we descended into the coolness of the cave, we were plunged into near darkness in no time. Flashlights winked on, and then we swept them around the big entrance of the cave, its ceiling hanging above us like a waiting predator. The beams fell on a series of tunnels. The tunnels, I remembered, were called the roots, and the cave we were in was the trunk. Many of the trails met up and cut back to the trunk, with only a few of them ending in dead ends. A ranger, or whoever was in charge of keeping bears and things out of this popular tourist destination, had nailed a plaque up on the wall that showed the various routes and intersections of the tunnels. We were all looking at the map when we heard the scream. It was otherworldly, like a banshee's cry, and it seemed to slice through the trunk like a knife through butter. We all looked up at the sound, and Reggie wasn't the only one who looked scared. We all stood perfectly still for a count of 5 before Reggie voiced what we were all thinking. What was that? Maybe, Bobby said, a sly grin stretching his face, it was the woods witch who lives in this cave. She smelled your dinner rolls and got hungry, Wedgie, he said, turning suddenly and grabbing a double handful of the boy's large and overflowing gut. Reggie screamed and tried to pull away, but Bobby had him in a firm grip and cackled madly as he pinched and pulled at the fat. Reggie finally pulled away, and as he stumbled, sobbing, to the stone floor, I found myself reaching to help him up. Knock it off, Bobby. Can't you just stop being a jerk for 5 seconds? Bobby oohed comically. Look here, guys. I think Squint's found himself a boyfriend. They laughed, but I ignored them and started down the closest tunnel. Anything to get away from Bobby and his arsehole brigade. I wasn't surprised when Reggie tagged along. The fat boy kept pace behind me easily, but I ignored him as we walked, taking paths at random. We walked in silence for a while, the tunnels becoming slightly claustrophobic before he thanked me for standing up for him. I guess no one had ever really stood up for Reggie before because he seemed unsure of himself as he tripped over his hastily constructed thank you. That Bobby is a real arsehole, he finished, and then covered his mouth like he'd committed blasphemy. I laughed a little. I couldn't help it. He can be. Just stand up to him, and maybe he'll stop. Reggie chuckled. Maybe he'll rip my head off, he said in a low voice. We came to a fork in the paths, and Reggie looked sheepishly at me. I've got to pee. Will you wait here for me? He asked, and after I nodded, he went down the left-hand path a ways until I couldn't see him any more. As I stood waiting, that stupid noise howled through the cave again, and it spiked every hair on my head in a shiver. What the hell is that? I thought to myself, and far from being scared, it made me curious. Caves don't just naturally scream, woods witch or not, and while I was sure the howling was how the cave got its name, I found myself wondering how it made the noise that it gave it. Suddenly, an unexpected and tall, humanoid shape lumbered from the darkness ahead and screamed at me. A beam of light lit its face, some 5 feet in the air, and I stumbled and fell backwards to the stone floor. I scrambled back on my hands and butt and felt my palms open up as the creature walked towards me and let out another ear-splitting howl. It towered over me as I sat on the cave floor, and all I could think to do was turn my flashlight on it and see what was going to kill me before it had devoured me. That's when the creature started laughing, and I realised that it was Bobby sitting on Mark's shoulders. I got up, spitting curses as the two boys separated, and I was getting ready to give them a piece of my mind when a new scream split the air. It wasn't the usual deep-throated howl of the cave, and it certainly wasn't the cry of some animal. It was a child's scream, and it was held all the fear and hopelessness of a child's life before he comes to learn that the real monsters are the ones sitting next to you in class. It was Reggie's scream, and without thinking, the three of us began to run towards it. We found Reggie sitting on the cave floor in much of the same way I had been a minute ago. He was crab walking backwards, his sneakers making little rubbery scuffing noises on the ground as he tried to climb the far wall. As I ran up, I caught a whiff of a weird smell, some metallic odour that became known to us when we finally came up even with the scared Reggie. Kyle's body hung limply from the cave wall. Someone had cut his throat for him and then opened his stomach down to the groin and let his entrails fall out in long ropes. Someone had pushed him against the wall. The red drag marks as he slumped proved that, and his clothes were soaked with red, sticky blood. The three of us took a few steps away from the body and then did what any of the boys our age would do when presented with the scene before us. We ran. The earlier trip from camp to the cave had taken about 30 minutes, but I'm pretty sure we ran back to the campsite in just under 10 minutes. I'm still a little hazy on how we got out of the cave so fast, but as we reached the familiar tents and fire pit, we collapsed in huffing piles of winded flesh. Reggie threw up noisily into the fire pit and none of us said two words about it. I, for one, felt like heaving myself, and Bobby looked like he might start heaving and crying at the same time. I guess seeing your friend gutted like a trout was a little different from drowning kittens in a sack. Hey, Bobby? We need to tell someone, Reggie huffed out as he wiped vomit from his shiny lips. Bobby sat up and moved towards the tent that Scoutmaster Mike still hadn't emerged from. It was getting on about midday, and the fact that he hadn't gotten up yet was starting to scare us. Bobby pushed on the tent flap, but it was still locked from the inside. We all started pushing on the tent and yelling for Scoutmaster Mike to get up and help us, but he never even stirred inside his fortress or canvas. Bobby became angry as his shoves and screams failed to rouse the Scoutmaster and went off to our tent to get something to cut it open with. 5 minutes later, he came out even angrier. "Alright, which one of you arseholes stole my knife?" he asked, his face red and starting to darken as he rounded on all of us in turn. "I bet it was you, Wedgie," he said, pushing the fat boy down so he could tower over him. "I bet you were the one who killed Kyle too, didn't you? You were the one who screamed. You were the one who found the body, and I bet you stole my knife so you could pin it all on me, didn't you?" Bobby was screaming at him, and Reggie, sobs had distinctly scared sound to him. I stepped between them before this escalated any further. "This isn't helping, Bobby. We need to get Scoutmaster Mike up so he can call the police and get some help and get us out of here." "And how would you suggest we do that, Gaylord? He probably got his earplugs in again so the creeps don't crawl in his brain while he's asleep. You remember last year, right? He slept through the whole jamboree because he got drunk the night before and put his earplugs in." I did. Scoutmaster Mike was pretty well known for getting drunk and sleeping through his duties, but we still needed him despite his shortcomings. We tried to cut the canvas with our scout knives, but it was a slow process. While Bobby had brought his father's old buck knife, probably a piece of steel sharp enough to shave with, our scout knives were dull, little things that were barely fit for the arts and crafts. Finally, after 10 minutes of hacking and digging, we worried a hole in the side of the canvas and let out an odour we smelled back in the cave. He'd been done the same way as Carl had, his throat cut, entrails spilled out, his face a mask of terror and disbelief, and we all flinched away from the tent in unison as the hole exposed the grisly scene. With nowhere else to run from the awful scene, we went back to our own tent and zipped the door shut. We sat huddled in the corner as far from the zippered opening as we could, and at that moment all past feuds were forgotten, all past crimes forgiven, and for just an instant we were united as one. I'm not sure how long we sat there shivering, but it was creeping towards evening when Reggie moved towards the cooler to get something to drink. His moving seemed to break the spell over us, and suddenly we were all preparing a dinner, or water bottles and granola bars. I pulled out my map as we ate and sat in between us. Okay, so here's where we are. The road is a mile from our campsite. The cave is half a mile back that way. And there's a ranger station half a mile past that Appalachian trail mark. Someone should go to the road and see if they can flag down a car, while someone else goes to the ranger station to see if they can get some help. The others will stay here at the campsite, so we have a safe place to come back to. Whoever stays here should stoke the fire and be on the lookout for whoever's doing this. 2 kids against a murderer? That sounds like a death sentence to me, said Bobby. Have you got a better idea? I asked, and he shook his head and said he didn't. We could check Mr. Mike's tent, Reggie said, his voice becoming less sure as we all turned to look at him. I just mean, he has that old bag phone, and he has the key to the truck, so he might, I don't know, have something that can help us. It's not a bad idea, I conceded, and decided to make my first stop the abattoir of Scoutmaster Mike. It was becoming shadowy as we ripped the tent open and stepped in. The smell of blood was everywhere, and Scoutmaster Mike lay in his sleeping bag like an overripe pea that had burst its pod. We tried our best to ignore him as we went about taking his stuff, but it's hard to ignore a dead body that's less than 5 feet from you. Flies had gotten into our hole from earlier, and they crawled like tiny mourners all across his gaping neck and chest. If Scoutmaster Mike believed in hell, then I can assume that this was it for him, his body awash with crawling insects while he lay powerless to stop them. We took his things out into the fresh air of the campsite. Scoutmaster Mike had an odd assortment of gear, to say the least. A compass, a fire starter, a Swiss Army knife which Bobby took, a flask of something alcoholic that was half empty, a cooler that was equal parts lunch meat, deli cheese, beer and melted ice, some rope, and a faded magazine called Bazoons, with a busty topless girl on the cover. His car keys, hunting knife and bag phone were nowhere to be found though. Had the killer taken them so we couldn't call for help? Why kill Scoutmaster Mike and not kill us immediately? As we sat around in the dying light of the day, the howling started again. It was loud and mournful, cutting across our nerves like a knife, and in our current state, it was enough to leave us shaking and unsure. It stopped after a few minutes, but a low grumble of it could be heard afterward if you listened hard. As the sun went down and the howling grumbled at the edge of hearing, I could almost believe that the woods witch, and not some murderous psycho, was responsible for all of this. Almost. I'll go to the ranger station, I said, getting up before I could think better of it. Bobby, why don't you go to the road and try and flag down a car and see if you can find someone to help us? Mark and Reggie can stay at camp and keep the fire stoked. I should be back in 2 hours tops with help. Sound like a plan? I had expected a token argument from Bobby, but it never came. He just nodded and, slipping the knife out of his pocket, strode off towards the parking lot where Scoutmaster Mike's old truck sat, waiting for us to return. Reggie begged to go with me, but I told him to stay here with Mark and help keep watch. He didn't fight me on it, but he slumped off dejectedly to sit on a log by the fire. With a nod to Mark, I set off for the ranger station. Like I said before, the trail to the cave is clear enough for a blind man to follow, but I didn't want to get anywhere close to a cave, if I could help it. I took the trail until I could see the heading for the cave and then broke off into the woods. I was trying to link up with another trail that went to the ranger station, but I must have gotten turned around because I soon found myself back at my original entry point after several minutes of scrambling through the woods. Then the howling started again. I don't know if it was a proximity to the cave or what, but for just a second I remember being unable to hear much besides the wailing that cut through the quiet night. It drove me to my knees as its pitch became higher, and as I glanced around, it seemed like the wow was moving in the trees itself. Thunder rumbled overhead and lit up the night for momentary bursts in time. I found my feet as the howling ebbed a little, and I realised that it wasn't the howling moving the trees, but the wind. A storm seemed to be brewing, and as I tried to find my bearings in the deepening dark, another fork of lightning split the sky. The flash was bright enough to illuminate a figure not 5 feet ahead of me. I added my own scream to the howling as the hunched and twisted creature was once again hidden by a tangle of forest. In the ebb of the howling, I could hear it creeping noisily towards me, and as the lightning pealed again, I got a brief glimpse of a steely blade in its bunched hand. It had a knife. The knife that had likely killed Kyle and Scoutmaster Mike. And if I didn't get out of here, it was going to kill me too. I ran then, turned tail and ran. And when I hit the trail I had left, I kept right on running, losing myself in the woods. I have no idea how far I ran, limbs whipping my face and brambles cutting my legs. But it was well and truly dark by the time I found the stream. I crashed into it like a herd of buffalo, and my foot snagged on a rock 3 steps in. I fell, tumbling into the cold water of the shallow stream, and cut my forehead on a jagged bit of rock. I came up sputtering, hand going to my forehead to staunch the blood, and as lightning flashed again, I saw something in the water. A neat little package was submerged in the sluggish current of the stream. It was wrapped in fabric of some kind, and I realised, as I unwrapped it, that it was a pair of scout shorts. They smelled awful, but the river had washed them somewhat and left them soggy. Inside the shorts was the Motorola bag phone Scoutmaster Mike had brought and the keys to his truck. Both had been drenched by the river, but the keys had been banged around and bent up, so I doubt they would even fit in the ignition of the truck. I stared at the things for a second, puzzled as to why someone would do this, when I realised the shorts were too big to belong to anyone but Reggie. Why steal Reggie's shorts just for this? That's when I heard someone screaming close to the river, and I realised how close the campsite actually was. I could see the shadowed hulks of our tents, and though the camp should have stood out like a beacon with its roaring fire, the flames had guttered, and the camp was bathed in shadows. A drop of rain hit my forehead as I stepped into camp, and a lightning flash lit up another body sitting next to the fire. In the brief spark of light, I was certain it would be Reggie. His protruding guts opened up and his guts overflowing, but as I came up beside the dying fire, I could see that it was Mark. He'd been done like the others, and I felt tears on my face as I knelt beside him. Mark was a shit, like Carl had been a shit, but they were still kids, and kids aren't supposed to die like this. Children are supposed to languish in the idea of immortality until the tragedies of teenage years bring reason before the death of youth and the birth of adulthood. No child out on a campout should have to face the idea that his life might be bled out next to his cook fire, and Mark was certainly no exception. Mark had wanted to be a baseball player, a dream a lot of little boys have, and though I didn't know him very well, I felt like he deserved better than this. When someone grabbed my hand, I felt my bladder let go as I pissed my pants. Mark's hand was slick with blood, but he clung to life even as it leaked out of him. His breathing was jagged and watery, but he seemed determined to impart some wisdom before he died. He put his other hand to his torn open throat and croaked out a single word. "Bobby!" "Bobby? Bobby did this to you?" I asked, but Mark shook his head in a small, jerking way. "Bobby! Gone! Reggie! Cave! Howling! Went! Help him!" He sputtered out the last with a gout of blood as he flopped back like a landed fish. I sat with him until he died, and then I made my way toward Howling Cave. I didn't want to. Howling Cave was the last place I wanted to go, but if the murderer had Reggie or Bobby, I felt like I needed to try and help them. That's what you do when someone's in trouble after all. You try to help them. I didn't feel like a little kid at the moment, and I didn't feel like I sometimes did when I pretended to be a superhero or some other thing for a game. I felt like the kids in the adventures book I read. I felt like I had to do the last thing I wanted to do, and that, if the monster was to be killed, then it was me who had to do it. The rain fell on me in sheets as I got close to the cave's mouth. The wind picked up, and as the trees shook and danced, the howling screamed across the forest in high, crystalline notes. I wondered, as I went, if maybe there was a woods witch waiting there for me there. Some boogeyman that I could blame all this on instead of some hardened psychopath with a taste for murder. I doubted it, but I almost hoped for a witch as I came to the mouth of the cave. Kids in stories tend to fare pretty well against magical creatures in the end. It was pitch black inside, but I had my flashlight. My beam found an easy trail to follow almost immediately. Someone had left bloody sneaker prints on the cavern floor, and I could only hope that they weren't left on purpose. I crept along through the tunnels, and as I went, I began to see signs of a fire up ahead. All of a sudden, the howling raced across me again, and I covered my ears to block it out. It was louder than I'd ever heard it, and the otherworldly wow made me want to fall down and cry. I moved towards the fire, always towards the fire, and it led me to a small chamber near the very back of the cavern. A placard on the wall declared that this was the witch's hovel, but I suspected that it had been set up after the legend got popular. There was a cauldron and some shelves along with some old books and a cane broom and... Bobby? My flashlight had found the back of a scout shirt, and as I moved closer, I could see Bobby Terry leaning against a corner like a naughty child. There was a spread pool of red around him, and I didn't even need to flip him over to know that he was too far gone to help. He was on his knees, face pressed against the stones, and I pulled my hand away from him before I could turn him around and put another death in my mind. I heard footsteps behind me and then flipped around to find the last person I expected to find. Reggie? He smiled at me, and with my flashlight glinted off the knife in his hand. He was none the worse for wear, though the bloodstains on his uniform looked fresh enough to make me think he'd been wounded. When the howling started again, I looked up towards the ceiling and felt stupid for being afraid earlier. The placement of the hovel in this chamber was pretty smart on someone's part, because the chimney, like the opening at the top of the cave, made the howling sound that I heard when the wind blew across it. The howling and wailing had been nothing but a big bottle for the wind to blow across. The revelation distracted me from Reggie, and that almost cost me my life. I was honestly hoping you'd make it out. You're the first person in the situation that has been genuinely nice to me, and I appreciate that. Really, I do, he said before snaking forward and trying to slice me with the knife. I stepped back from him, and the blade cut a long gash in the front of my uniform, but never hit the skin. I took another step back and analysed this new Reggie that I'd never met before. This wasn't the soft-spoken, scared little boy from the camp who's pissed his pants and shrunk from bullies. This Reggie was competent, crafty, a creature who waddled less and stalked more. He looked at me like an artist who's sizing up a marble for his next sculpture, like a painter who's trying to winkle the next masterpiece from the canvas, a writer wheedling his next bestseller from an ether, a predator contemplating his next meal. I thought about running, but he was blocking the only exit. I could juke around him, maybe, but he'd proven himself to be very quick already. I found myself backing up instead, Reggie walking forward with all the ease of a B-movie slasher. And suddenly my heel struck something on the floor and I tripped. I cursed myself mentally as I fell, and Reggie stalked in easy as you please as I grabbed as I crab walked backwards. "Why, Reggie?" I asked, unable to help myself. "Why would you do this?" Reggie seemed to think for a minute before shrugging. "Because I can." The knife opened up my stomach in a single slash, and as his entrails spilled out, the witch laughed and laughed, having claimed yet another victim. The police would later find the bodies of the scouts and their scoutmaster, but no sign of weapon or killer would ever be discovered. To this day, they say you can hear the witch's unearthly howl on a quiet night, and those who sleep within her woods may find themselves to be her next victims. The campers sat around the fire with big, moony eyes as I finished the story, and they all glanced around as the fire crackled, trying to get a glimpse of the witch's wood witch before she got them. The wood suddenly caught a pine knot, and a loud crack made all of them jump before laughing at their own jitters. The 7 scouts, none older than I had been when I first stepped into the woods, discussed the story in low whispers among themselves. A podgy, freckle-faced scout with the unfortunate name of Davy spoke up just as I thought they were about to settle in for the night and drift to their tents. "Scoutmaster Lawson, is there really a woods witch?" One of them, a tow-headed kid named Ken, who reminded me a lot of Bobby Terry, guffawed loudly and made a rude noise. "Oh, little Davy's scared of the wood witch. It's just a story, Nimrod." Actually, my own scoutmaster told us about the woods witch when I camped in these woods. It's a local legend that's supposed to have some historical fact, though I doubt she still lives around here anymore, I said, tousling Davy's hair as he started to look worried. "Thanks, Scoutmaster Lawson," Davy said, putting another marshmallow on his stick and holding it over the fire. I smiled at him. "Call me Reggie. My friends used to, anyway." Wow, wow, wow. I hope you guys enjoyed that story. Very good twist at the end. Big thanks to the author for writing that story. Absolutely really enjoyed it. Please do let me know down below in the comments, guys, what you think. As ever, guys, please do like and share. And remember, be safe, not sorry.